Alright, hello everyone. This is my presentation on modernism in English 252 class. Alright, so a little bit about it. Began after World War I, so that's from 1914 to 1918, and it ran into the 20s and 30s, which was a very popular period for jazz and the Roaring 20s. And some notable modernists to point out are Fitzgerald and Hemingway, and also include some influencers and the time period and the traditional Victorian styles and the experimentation that occurred during modernism. Okay, so this is my definition of modernism that I picked out. It strive to be accustomed to modern life and ways of interpretation in literature. I chose this because it was so straightforward, and it's basically what modernism was all about. So modernism was reaching for a new style because the one that they had now was not accustomed to modern life. And modernists, they believed that current language, which was the Victorian style, was not applying to individuals of the time period because of everything that was going on. We had new developments with World War One. We have new technology, interpretations with psychology and sociology, and it just expressed new forms of expression. I would say so. All right, and my next slide, the 21st century. This is in regards to today's world, just to get a little bit more modern and just to get a good idea of modernism in general. So in the top picture, the first one, we see bike racing. So long time ago, the bikes weren't as good or as, advanced as the bikes that we have now in the 21st century. So you see we have new tires, we have a new carbon fiber frame, the helmets are more safe for riders, and we have a steel frame in the old times, and then the wheels weren't as good, and it just wasn't as efficient as the bikes that we have now. And in the other picture on the right, we see we have a mom in the late 1950s telling her kid to go to his room because he's outside a lot, he's playing, he's being really active, and that's good, but they were always outside because the technology then, they didn't have the technology that we have now. So there was really no reason for them to always be inside the house. But in today's world, punishment would be to get out of your room, get off of your phone, get off the computer, go outside and experience nature and be more active, basically. And some things that worth mentioning in regards to modernism would be music. Changes and shifts in music is a big one. Clothes, style, the slang that we use evolves over time also to become more accustomed to the era that we live in. And also a notable one is technology. Technology is always changing, it's shifting, and so modernism, it could be better, it could be for the better, or it could be for the worse, depending on the situation or who it's affecting, really. Okay, and for the time period is from 1914 to 1918, but some debate that it started in the 20th century, but really it was after World War One, and going into the 20s and 30s. It was first used by British journalist Ralph Arnold Scott James, who was in the Modernism and Romance. His Modernism and Romance text was really prevalent. And A quote that I picked out from it reads, "There are characteristics of modern life in general which can only be summed up, as Mr. Thomas Hardy and others have summed them up, by the word modernism." Okay. And two modernists that I'm mentioning are F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway. So F. Scott Miss Fitzgerald was born September 24th, 1896, in St. Paul, Minnesota. Um, he was really during the Roaring Twenties, when there was economic prosperity, and there was a distinct like culture edge. So this is a jazz age after World War One, and really, really, really popular book, and now film that F. Scott wrote was The Great Gatsby. Um, so with The Great Gatsby, it was a really good example of modernism, because in The Great Gatsby we had flappers, we had jazz, people were speaking different. It was a little bit more free, and music was a really big thing during the Roaring Twenties. It was really evolving during this time, and people defied prohibition. There was new dance. There was a lot of dancing going on, parties, which is also incorporated into The Great Gatsby. There were Gatsby, the main character, threw a lot of big, extravagant parties, and we had a lot of dancing and music going on in this book also. And another one, Ernest Hemingway, born July  21st, 1899, in Illinois. He wrote a book called The Sun Also Rises. So with his style of writing, it was like a detached point of view, which the speaker is not identified, but the characters are still speaking. So that was a big thing with modernist writers, such as Ernest Hemingway. And in this book, people typically live through their experiences of everyday life. So that was also becoming more prevalent. People were experiencing things and going day by day and living life, and they were doing their thing. So, and in his writing, he wrote about experiences during World War One in his stories. So, since modernism writers, it was becoming more popular during World War One and afterwards, he showed really good examples in his stories. And a famous quote by Ernest Hemingway that I found that I really love is, "There is nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self." So I just thought about that. And these are influencers of modernism. Emily Dixon and Walt Whitman are romanticists. And Emily Dixon was born in Massachusetts, and she questioned the nature of immortality and death. And some unique poetry by her is a poem that she wrote called "I'm Nobody." This poem, everything that, even with all the things that she has done, she still felt as though she was no one. All the art that she created and all the people she's reached, she still felt not good enough. So she was an influencer of modernism, but she wasn't in the modernism period. Romanticists typically were more about nature and self-being, or being, nature and being. And that's also Walt Whitman with transcendentalism and realism. Transcendentalism was a time period where they believe that nature is our spiritual home. It makes up man and nature as our spiritual beings. So that was interesting. And with the experimental side and how it stripped away from the Victorian era, so modernism was super experimental. It typically reached huge heights of consciousness for most people in the audience that writers reached. Um, and it stripped away from the Victorian era. They needed a more relatable language. So, which F. Scott Fitzgerald was also a really good example of that with his works. And it was no longer applied to the common person. There was a new language and new forms of expression that came from this era of modernism. All right, these are my works cited, and thank you guys for watching.